Welcome to Montgomery Smashing the Stigma, a podcast that shares stories about mental health and wellness and connects people with groups and solutions to help smash the stigma about getting help.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Smashing the Stigma podcast. I'm Amy Frederick.
And I'm Connie Gaylor. In this episode, we're talking about children and grief.
November is National Childhood Grief Awareness Month. An estimated 6 million children in the U.S. will experience the death of a parent or sibling by age 18.
In this episode, Laura Holmes, a program manager with Companions on a Journey, will be with us.
So let's talk a little bit about Companions on a Journey and what your organization does.
Sure. So Companions on a Journey does grief support. So we have grief groups for adults, different types of groups. So we have like widowed groups. We have Hope and Healing After Suicide. We have a family group, quite a few different groups. And then we also do grief support groups in schools as well. So we are in almost 70 schools around the Cincinnati area. And then we also will do crisis grief support as well. So if we've had a student or a teacher die in a school, sometimes we do that for a business as well. We will go in and support for a day, sometimes a couple days after that. And then we also do some one-on-one grief support services as well.
Man, that's really awesome. How long have you been with Companions on a Journey?
So I've been with COJ for about 3.5 years.
And what led you, other than your degree, but what led you to go down the path of grief support?
Sure. So I had been a mental health therapist for a while, and the job popped up with COJ for me to work with them. And I said, that sounds really interesting. So I mostly work in the schools. And so I like the idea of working with kids, doing groups. I love doing groups. I also get to work with social work interns as well, so teaching them. But then I think for grief specifically, when I was a mental health therapist, you were really working on like treating those mental health disorders. But grief is different. You're not trying to treat it. You're just trying to come alongside people, know that they're not alone, trying to support them. And I think that really fits with who I am.
Yeah, I agree. I think when it's a passion that you feel really connected to, you also feel rewarded in what you're doing.
Absolutely.
So today we kind of want to focus on childhood grief specifically. I was doing some reading and some research and just thinking about, all the ages and the differences. Can you kind of tell us why age is really important in the support process with grief?
Sure. Yeah. So I think age plays a big factor, first of all, developmentally, right? When you have a really young kid, they may not even understand what death is. So I have a 4-year-old. I've lost 3 grandparents over the last couple of years. So we've talked kind of a lot about death, also because of what I do. So we'll like pass a cemetery and I'll say, that's where people are buried after they die. And we'll talk about that. And I'll try to be pretty, I'll try to be pretty explicit in that I say or concrete, I guess would be the word. When someone dies, that means their body no longer works. They can't talk. They can't walk. They don't breathe. So trying to explain that. And for a while, she would just kind of take it in. And then all of a sudden, one day, we're passing a cemetery. She goes, am I going to die? I don't want to die. Are you going to die? I don't want you to die. So it's really interesting to see how it was like starting to click with her. But then I also had a friend pass away recently too. And I was telling her, this friend died. Her body no longer works. And she said, can I meet her? I said, well, no, she died. And she said, but I want to meet her. So it was really interesting how she doesn't, she didn't fully get it. So with those really, really young ones, you have to be really clear on what dead means because they may think that, oh, mom died. She's just on a trip. She's going to come back. So obviously that really changes how you're going to work with that age. And really get abstract thinking comes around 11. And so that changes how those individuals would think of grief. But yeah, so really playing to that developmental piece and what's going on in their lives at the time, it really makes a big difference.
So if you do have a death in your family and you have a young child, They, like you said, they don't always understand it. But what are some specific behaviors that they might be doing differently, or that you can spot that that's grief? Because I know if you have a young child, they don't know how to label it, they don't know what to call it, but their behavior is definitely different. What's some things that maybe a parent could look for, or something like that?
Sure. So I would say with the really young kids, you're going to see a lot of like clinginess, fussing. So if they're not really able to talk it out, you're going to look for kind of more behavioral and emotional. The children, like let's say elementary, they may be able to start to identify it. With a lot of them, we start to see, and this would be with teens too, anxiety is pretty common. So starting to worry that somebody else might die as they start to understand that and process that. There's a lot of physical complaints that we'll see in grief. So stomach aches, headaches, difficulty sleeping is a common one. Separation anxiety can happen with grief. And then I would say with those teenagers, what's challenging with them is that they are starting, because of their age, they're starting to rely more on peer support now, right? And so trying to find adults that they want to talk to, because a lot of their peers aren't really going to understand what they're going through. So we want them to have some adults that they can turn to as well. But you might see some angry behaviors, reckless behaviors from teenagers, definitely anxiety. Guilt can be common in kids and teens. Sometimes especially those early elementary age, they may think that they caused the death, even if they really weren't related. What they did wasn't really even related to the death, but if they had certain thoughts in their head, they might have thought that kind of magically caused the death. So I think clearing that up is really important.
It's tough because sometimes children don't always tell you what they're thinking. Mm-hmm. So, and then I thought another interesting point that when we think of grief, we always think of a death, of a loved one, a grandparent, a parent, a sibling, but there are other types of grief that kids can experience. Mm-hmm. Why don't you tell us about that? Sometimes it does deal with death, like a pet, but other changes in a kid's life that might also be a cause for grief.
Yeah. So one thing I think is so powerful in working with grief is that we will all experience grief. We all have experienced grief. So not all of us have necessarily experienced a death that was close to it, but we've all had changes in our life, right? So if you've ever had a big move, a divorce, anything like that, so that is grief too. And sometimes that grief is not recognized in the same way that a death is recognized, right? Like if a kid has a parent die, people around them are going to know that this is very challenging for them and let's support them. But if they move to a different school, that can be grief too, but that may not be as acknowledged in the same way. So helping kids to process through that and work through that. Obviously with that, there's probably going to be, positives and negatives that come with it versus the death of a parent is going to be very, very challenging for them. Moving to a new school is probably going to have good and bad things that come with it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How would you advise parents, to handle those different kind of conversations? We kind of talked about the loss of an actual loved one in their life, mm-hmm. but what we don't want to do is demean their grief. We don't want it to sound like, oh, you just moved to a different school. Mm-hmm. But to them, it's huge. Mm-hmm. It's the loss of what they knew into something that they don't, and the anxiety. So how would you tell Amy and I how to handle that with kids?
Yeah. So I would say the first would be giving them opportunities to talk about what they're going through. So obviously it depends on the age. Some kids are going to readily come to you and tell you all about their day. Other kids are not. So just giving those opportunities, making sure you're spending a lot of one-on-one quality time with them as much as you can, giving the space for them to talk and process it. I would say that would be first. And if they are a kid who then wants to share, hopefully they will. I think otherwise prompts are really important. So I think with the younger kids, I love to use books. So getting books out from the library on moving to a new school and then reading that and asking questions as we go along, like, oh, I see Jimmy from the book. He's really sad. Have you felt sad too as you moved to a new school? So giving those prompts, you can also say like, hey, when I was a kid, if this is true for you, when I was a kid or when so-and-so was a kid and they may have moved to a new school, they were really sad and it was really hard for them to make new friends. Have you experienced that same thing? So getting them to be able to talk about it. Kids also express how they're feeling in play. So paying attention to what their play looks like. You can also encourage them to use artwork. So can you draw a picture of what school looks like for you, what your friends look like? And they may be able to better express it through play or through art.
I can only think of like when you say, I think books and stuff, I actually think that's a really great idea. How do you, and maybe it's just me, I have a teenager, but how do you start a conversation? Because I think as parents, sometimes you just want to jump in and help. What are like some key words just to start?
Yeah, so I would say, like I said, making that space. I feel like I hear teenagers a lot will want to talk in the car or talk at the most inopportune times.
Like right before bed,
right?
My daughter.
Bed, yes. So I think allowing that sometimes, even though it's like, oh, no, they're getting less sleep. I don't want them to. But I think if they are willing to talk then, take advantage of that opportunity. I would say some specific words. It really does depend on the kid. But I think if you can kind of relate it to peers or relate it to your own experience or someone else's experience, I think that's what I would probably start with.
Do you feel like, how would you approach this situation if this, you were working with a child who had special needs, who, had a bad experience in the past, such as, maybe this is a child that's a foster child or who were adopted, had already lost a family, was in a totally different situation. Do you meet those types of challenges when you're in the schools? And, how do you handle that?
Yeah, we absolutely do. And so if they've come from a traumatic situation, that is absolutely going to impact their grief. I do a grief training for some of our volunteers and interns, and I think it's 2 or 3 whole sides on what the impact of grief looks like on an individual. So grief is different for every individual, and here's why. And it lists 15 different reasons, and we could probably list more. And one of those is trauma. So when we're talking about these traumatic situations, it's interesting what we've seen with some individuals. If we go for crisis support, we always ask, is there anyone else who has had a significant loss or anyone who's had a significant trauma? We want to look out for those individuals and kind of check on them because they may not have even been close to the person who's died, yet they might be the one who is most impacted just because of their past. And so really paying attention to that, looking out for that, I think is really important.
No, I agree. I feel like, say you're dealing with a child who's been separated from a parent because the parent is incarcerated. And then that parent passes, even though they weren't in their day-to-day life. I feel like they're grieving 2 things. The parent that was never around, and then losing them and that being a permanent thing in their mind. So they're grieving what they wish they would have had, and then they're grieving that it never can be. And I feel like that is just compounds it and makes the trauma of it even more, So, at some point, what you're doing in the schools is going to require more for that child outside of the school. And I don't know if parents or foster parents or even the school, when did they step in and say, okay, now we're going to take the next step. We're going to have to get more professional help for this young kid who is needing more than an in-school program, because it's leading into a lot more trauma and depth in their situation than maybe somebody who's dealing with a loss because they've moved schools, or they lost a friend who moved schools, or maybe they lost a pet, which is all traumatic in itself, but it's to me, it just doesn't seem quite as deep of an issue that has to be treated as the child who's had compounded grief. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Saying?
Yeah. And we have a lot of kids who will see, what we do is not therapy, it's grief support. And so we have kids who will say that they see a therapist, whether that's for grief, I'm not sure. I think sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But absolutely, what comes to mind when you talk about a kid who's had a parent who's incarcerated and then that parent passes away, I think sometimes that doesn't click with them right away. So what's interesting with kids and grief too is kids tend to grieve in bursts. So they might seem fine for a while and then all of a sudden they're upset. And especially if they hadn't seen that parent, let's say in months, it might not really sink in because our brain is actually a death doesn't fully click with our brain right away. There's a really interesting book. It's called The Grieving Brain, and the name of the author is escaping me, but I really love the book. And she talks about our brain is used to forming attachments, and it's used to, if I ask you, where are all your loved ones right now? You probably have a pretty good idea, right? Because we're used to, we leave them for the day and then we come back together. Well, when someone dies, they're not coming back to us, but our brain doesn't usually get that right away. It takes some time. And so I think it's similar for a kid, especially a kid who's young developmentally, who may not even fully understand what death means. If they had a parent they hadn't seen in months, it might not click with them. So that kid might seem totally fine for a long time. And then they go to, they win a math competition and this was a big deal. And then all of a sudden their grief hits them because they're like, oh, dad should have been here. So we really see that grief develop. It can come out in milestones. We have kids in our group who may have had a parent pass away when they were 3 years old and now they're 16, but they're still deeply grieving because, as you said before, they start to realize, my sister's not going to be there for all these things later on in life. And they're just kind of just now piecing that together.
Yeah, I think that's tough.
Too, is there a way to prepare your child? Like if say their grandparent has cancer and it's going to be terminal, is there a way to start talking to your child early to sort of prepare them?
So unfortunately, we call it anticipatory grief is the grief that you feel before the person dies. And unfortunately, anticipatory grief, can I just pre-grieve? And it's kind of shown that you really can't. Not to say that wouldn't be helpful for anyone, but in general, you're going to have that anticipatory grief and then you're going to have a different grief once they actually do pass away. I would say what you can do, I think it is helpful, though, to start talking to the kid about it, especially because you want them to be able to say what they want to say, spend time with the grandparent, ask the grandparent any questions, make special memories together. I think having tangible objects can be really helpful. So maybe the grandparent and the kid could make something together. And then that is something that kid is going to be able to, hold close to them throughout their life.
That makes sense. I think that's a great idea. Mm-hmm. When do you think you've talked to your child about grief, but when do you think it's time to call professional help?
I would say we always want to involve, from a mental health perspective, we want to involve professionals when it's causing significant distress in one or more areas of life, right? So if it's significantly impacting home life or school or life out in the community, that's one sign. And then also if they're harming themselves or others. You know, we want to have that assessed. We say basically all grief reactions are normal, except if you're hurting yourself or others.
Yeah, I was thinking, we're right on the edge of the holiday season, which is hard for anybody when you're missing somebody. But sometimes I think adults have problems knowing how to move forward through the holidays. So how do we do that with kids? And, when is it good to carry on the same traditions, make new traditions? How have you seen that affect kids that you've dealt with?
Yeah, we pay, really special attention to the holidays. We do the same activity in November and the same activity in December every year in our schools because we really love those activities. And I think it really has to be a family by family basis and a child by child basis. So asking the kid what they want, and they may not know. So we're all just doing the best we can, because the parent is probably grieving too. And so we want to honor that. But I think talking about that as a family, what would feel best for us as a family. But I think if you're able to have some way to honor that family member that you've lost, that's helpful. So whether it's, we're going to make grandma's special cookies this year and we're going to enjoy those together. I will say too, what is really, really common for individuals is year 2 is often harder than year 1. So when you've gone through a significant loss, a lot of people feel kind of in a fog in year 1. And then year 2 is kind of when reality hits. So that first holiday may or may not be super tough, right? Often it's that second one when everything's that kind of slowed down and that death has really sunk in that can be harder. But it really varies, individual to individual.
So really falling back to things that you've already kind of suggested, it's just having those conversations with them. How are you feeling? What would you like to do? I guess noticing if they seem more down, that time of the year, which you would expect. But I guess just keeping an eye on each other.
Yeah. And being flexible, being willing to change that plan. With kids in grief, we want to have a good structure for them, right? Having a plan, kids are going to feel more secure with structure. But then also being willing to be flexible for yourself and for your kid. Because if you're grieving too, you got to take care of yourself.
Right. Yeah, so true. So you're in 70 different schools. Is that what you said?
Almost 70. Mm-hmm.
And is that all ages? Is that elementary?
It is all ages. Yes. And I will clarify, not me specifically, but my team is at almost 70 schools. Yep. We are in kindergarten through senior year. We're in public. We're in private schools. So we really see everybody.
That's phenomenal. I don't remember having that when I was in school, which was many moons ago, but the support that is out there now, that's so valuable. That makes a big difference for the parents too, because if the kids are getting support at school when they get home, maybe the grief that mom and dad are feeling is a little bit balanced because they feel like the kids are getting, the help that they need too. So that's awesome.
And one thing that's unique about us too is our groups are open. So that means any kid can join at any time and they can stay in group as long as they want. So it's our goal to continue to, as long as the schools want us back, we continue to go to the same schools year after year. So we have some kids who will stay in it for years because grief doesn't end, it just changes. And so to be able to support them, we come in monthly, support them year after year.
That's so important because like you said, they could kind of be on a roller coaster of grief where they're feeling good and maybe they don't come as much. And then a milestone hits where they really miss having that mom or dad or whoever, in their life. And then hopefully they'll come back to you.
Yep.
That's
exactly.
the hope, right? Mm-hmm. So
So is there anything you want to share with us about Companions on a Journey, how people can get a hold of you, if you have a website, a telephone number, Facebook page?
Yeah, so we have all the above.
I figured.
So our website is companionsonAjourney.org. Facebook, I think if you just search for Companions on a Journey, I want to say it's one of the first ones, but I've never, I looked at our Facebook page, but I'm not sure exactly how to find it. But I think you could just search in there. And then off the top of my head, our phone number is 513-870-9108. And we have people call in and just say, hey, I'm looking for a support group, and we're happy to help you find the one that's the right fit for you.
That's good to know that. And we also want to recognize that November 21st is National Childhood Grief Day.
Kids are kind of forgotten in their grief, but, we always say if a kid is old enough to love, they're old enough to grieve. And so no matter what age they are, we want to support them in their grief as best as we can.
I think that's a good note to end on. We want to thank you, Laura, for joining us today, and thank you for listening.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening. If you or a loved one are in a crisis and need immediate help, call or text the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline at 988.